My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we uncover a sinister, cold-blooded plot. Although, in fairness, everything they do is cold-blooded, as we go up against the cult of the Reptile God.
Our first segment is the Basic Crawl. Dungeon Module N1, Against the Cult of the Reptile God, is a 28-page adventure for advanced Dungeons & Dragons for characters of levels 1 to 3, published by TSR in 1982. It was written by Douglas Niles with development from Alan Hammock and edited by John Pickens. Fun fact, the book itself does not contain any art credits. We had to go look that up. But it turns out the cover art is by Tim Truman, and the interior art is by Truman, Jim Holloway, Harry Quinn, and Stephen Sullivan.
As for the contents, we begin with the customary intro, GM's background and notes, an introduction to the village of Orlane, where the action begins, and facts about the cult and rumours player characters may have heard. This is some of what the introduction has to say about the cult that drives all of the action in this adventure. Below the fetid waters of the Rushmoors extends a 2-level network of damp and dingy tunnels. This is the headquarters of the cult, and the lair of the evil spirit Naga that has installed itself as a god. Here, kidnapped citizens are brought and subjected to the permanent charm of the foul serpent. Charmed persons are returned to the village as cult members, and in this insidious fashion, the cult has slowly been growing in size. We then move swiftly on to beginning the adventure. Yay, box text. And then it's the key to Orlane, that is the village, and these are, well, descriptions of various farms, the constable's barracks, 2 inns, 1 nice, 1 evil, some shops, a blacksmith's, cottages, etc., and so on. Some of the residents are in the brainwashed reptile cult, others are not, and in some cases are living in paranoia and fear because they suspect what's going on. We're also introduced to Ramne, the local friendly wizard, and then there's a key to specific areas in Orlane, specifically the Golden Grain Inn, that's the bad one, 25 keyed rooms, including a mini dungeon in the cellar. The Inn of the Slumbering Serpent, the safe one, 12 keyed rooms there. And then the Temple, which has been taken over by the cult, 22 keyed locations. The next section, before we move on to the cult's dungeon, is sort of bridging that gap, and it's called Cult Activity as Time Passes. It's a page or so, and it includes what's going to happen, assuming the player characters don't do anything to interrupt, and what happens if PCs get captured by the cult. That's then followed by the Trail to the Reptile God's Lair, which details the trek through the random encounters in the swamp that take you to the Dungeon of the Reptile God. This is the 2-level dungeon alluded to in the intro, 37 locations, and a massive Naga boss monster at the end. A Naga, by the way, is just a big snake with a human face and evil magic. There is a half page on further adventures that may follow, and of course the adventure comes with maps. There is a large poster map of the village, and then 4 pages of maps of the inns, the temple, and dungeon levels 1 and 2. Fun side note here, the temple map has an error. There's a little maze section that you're supposed to be able to pass through if you find the right way, but they didn't draw an exit onto it, so one for GMs to note in advance.
Let's talk about how we have used Against the Cult of the Reptile God in our games. I'll start by saying that I have run this as part of an experiment called the Golden Shroud campaign. I should probably say briefly what that is. I proposed on our blog, on the Gauntlet blog, and indeed within our community, that I was going to try this sort of meta gaming thing whereby players would be playing individuals playing a role-playing game, and they'd be playing characters playing a role-playing game. So it'd be 2 layers of fiction. You would have this sort of like real-world layer of fiction, and then you would have like the dungeon adventure, part of the fiction. And the idea is that this all tied up to mystery taking place in the real world fiction of this missing kid who wrote this like really elaborate fantasy adventure campaign called the Golden Shroud campaign. And by playing in the adventures, you would kind of piece together the mystery of what happened to this missing teenager. I ran it for that. We did not quite finish. And so, yeah, the experiment was successful-ish. I have a lot of things I'd like to do to it if I go back to doing this idea. But the players seem to enjoy it, but I was not super happy with it.
All right. I mean, I am now slightly concerned that in real life, you, Jason, have written an elaborate fantasy campaign called The Golden Shroud, which could lead to your doom. But hey.
Indeed. I am indeed not here. This is just, I'm a phantasm.
Sinister. I used the village part as the cliched creepy village in a one-on-one game of Hearts of Wulin, which led me to realize I wanted to do it in D&D as well. So I also ran it as 2 sessions of Holmes Basic D&D, which, due to limited continuity between those 2 sessions, and I'd set it in Song Dynasty China in a kind of pseudo water margin setting, of which more later. And we decided that the first session was a kind of classic 60s Shaw Brothers movie adaptation of a novel or something. And then the second session was a TVB Hong Kong drama in the 90s with different actors. So if your characters didn't quite act the same way or remember what was going on, that was why.
So in other words, both of us approached this completely out of the spirit in which it was intended, basically. Let's talk about things we liked about Against the Cult of the Reptile God. Why don't you start, Tom?
Let's look at the basic structure of it. This is a great example of the town plus dungeon model, which is pretty well known. Some might say hackneyed by this point. You show up in an out-of-the-way place, it quickly becomes clear that all is not as it seems. But often, what we've seen, I think in a few, well, actually, in the ones we've reviewed, I would say just Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh has this. And the issue there is that the town where the adventure is based, Saltmarsh in that case, isn't really connected to the things that happen in the adventure places, which is the ship and the haunted house. But here, the cult acts both in the dungeon and within the village itself, and maybe most of the adventure happens within the community. And this was the first, or one of the first, published D&D adventures to do this.
I like that about it as well, the fact that the village and the dungeon do feel like one piece, for sure. And you're right, it is the kind of, it is the proto-village plus dungeon kind of adventure, which is now so common, right? Just on this show alone, we've reviewed, gosh, so many modules that have a similar setup, right? I mean, just off the top of my head, I'm lying, I'm off the top of my notes. Scenic Dunsmith, Something Stinks in Stilton, The Corruption of Pellersk, more or less is that. It's not quite a dungeon that you go to, but it's kind of the same thing. Ravenloft. It's a classic setup. And for the first one, I think it gets everything right? Like, it's a really enjoyable one. I mean, this is the type of, setting aside the sort of village plus dungeon, it's also another thing that I really love in gaming, and that a lot of my gaming, kind of revolves around, my fantasy gaming, which is the creepy mystery village, right? This idea that your characters go into this village and there's some kind of secret. There's a cult, or or they're all under some kind of gesh, or there's some kind of, like monster that they're all enthralled to, or whatever, right? And I have use this setup in my own adventures that I've written, and I enjoy adventures in this way. And this is a really good one. Like the central core mystery of who's a member of the reptile cult, who's not, the way that unfurls is very satisfying.
Yeah, I agree. It's, well, as you say, creepy mystery villages are great. And this one it's actually hard to pull out specific things that are good, because a lot of what is good about it is the way that different places and people are connected to each other, and that, some people are suspicious of other people, some people know things about others, or they are mistaken about other people. And also because, like we say, it's a forerunner to what is now basically just good practice in setting up community-based adventures. So, like, praising it just seems obvious in some ways.
We frequently ask people to give us suggestions for things to run, right? Like, hey, what should we run to cover on Fear of a Black Dragon? And so many people say Against the Cult of the Reptile God, right? Like, it's a common recommendation, and it's part of the reason why I ran it. And a lot of people tell me in particular, they're like, oh, based off what I know about you, Jason, you're going to love this. And I do like it. I think it's really good. But to kind of piggyback off what you're saying, Tom, it doesn't feel particularly special, right? Like it's really good at what it does, and it's more or less the first of what it does, but it doesn't necessarily stand out against, Something Stinks in Stilton. I mean, that's a much more like intense, kind of version of this, right? And has some interesting like kind of themes and humor to it, right? That this doesn't have. So this is not to like knock against the Cult of the Reptile God. I can definitely see why it's important, and I can see why people love it, but it doesn't feel today remarkable.
True, although I think, and I'm going to slightly angle into one of your notes I've seen here, I think it's very reusable. I would definitely pick this up to use again next time I wanted a sinister village. I mean, Something Stinks in Stilton. It's kind of a fixed length, right? You can't extend it or compress it that much. Whereas, as you've observed, I think about this, it's very adaptable, right?
It does scale. And I know this in practice because it's more or less what I had to do. Like the way I only had a certain number of sessions to get this done. And part of those sessions was taken up by this like meta layer that I'd kind of done with the Golden Shroud campaign, right? So truly, we were scheduled for 4 sessions, but it was really only like 2.5 in total that I could actually really do against the Cult of the Reptile God, right? What I think is great about this module is it seems very scalable. You could do the whole thing, meaning you go through all of Orlane, you do the 2 mini dungeons in Orlane, the Inn and the Temple, and then you do the Trek, and then you do the 2-level dungeon. And that's probably about, I'm guessing, 6 sessions or so, 5 or 6 sessions, somewhere in that neighborhood. Maybe a little bit more, depending on how much time you spend on some of those village mini dungeons. You could do that, or there are whole big parts of this that you can cut out and still get the basic feeling of the module, right? For example, in the village of Orlane, you have quite a number of locations with NPCs and things, and some of them are cultists, some of them are not, and that's very fun to kind of like see that all kind of unfurl. But you can get the exact same effect by just having like 1 family member be cultists, right? Or 2 family members be cultists. There's no need for it to be like 75% of the town or half the town, right? You can get the same idea by, you can cut out the inn part, you can cut out the temple part, you can just have a little bit of a mystery surrounding a couple of families in the village, and then just get straight to the dungeon, right? Like, you don't have to do all of it in order to get the full sort of emotional and atmospheric and thematic impact of it, in my opinion. I think it's going to be really cool if you do it all, but I don't think you necessarily have to. And so you can kind of take pieces out and kind of scale it down for what you want to do. I also think, and this is pretty extreme, but I think you could, even if you were really pressed for time, like say you only had 1 or 2 sessions, you could just narrate a summary of the village part and just put the characters straight on the road to the dungeon, right? With the Naga. You could do that too. I don't think that would be as fulfilling. I think you would miss a big part of what makes the module cool. And we're definitely kind of entering expert Delve territory here if I keep going. But like,
it would be a shame to skip it. Yeah.
But I think you could do it, and I think you would still get the same impact. And like you said, you can't do this with some of these other things we've looked at. Like Something Stinks in Stilton, you got to do the whole thing, and you're kind of set with what it is. Like there's no way of kind of like untying all that stuff, right? This one, on the other hand, is quite adaptable. Anything else you want to say that you liked about it?
Yeah, let's talk about slightly more nitty-gritty things. The locations in the village, some of them begin with the bolded words, "Cult members," with an exclamation mark, which is very useful because that's the first thing you need to know as soon as the PCs rock up to those places.
Agreed. I had that as one of my notes as well. When you're running it, that little like bolded cult member, like right before each description, is super helpful because you want to know that before they walk into the hut or the constable's office or whatever, right? Like you want to know that beforehand so that you can already start to kind of think about the role play on that. It is quite helpful. It seems silly when you're looking at it, but it's pretty good.
Yeah, it turned out to be really good. I also liked how the dungeon is semi-submerged, lots of different water levels going on. I think a lot of lesser adventures would have said, "Oh yeah, the dungeon's in a swamp," and then forgotten all about that.
And they forget about the swamp parts, yeah.
But this is really nice, the way you suddenly have this strange environment to navigate. I thought that was pretty cool. There's one NPC I particularly like. There's a sinister assassin who's hanging around in the evil tavern. The first impression you get of him is that he's a nasty piece of work. And he is. He's the classic kind of gangster movie, the smirking one who plays with a flick knife and is probably going to torture somebody the hero likes at some point in the movie.
Let's talk about the final boss encounter, because I know we both have that on our lists. It's pretty cool. I think the final boss monster, the Spirit Naga, is a pretty great encounter. I didn't get to play it. I've only read that part, unfortunately, because of the way my little campaign was set up. I love the approach to the boss. Like, they're underground in this cave system, and they have to like paddle across this like inky black water to get to this little island thing where the boss is, and that is just such a great, striking visual. Reminds me a lot of Sailors on the Starless Sea, and I don't know. I thought that was pretty great.
Yeah, it's a cool monster. It's got an interesting plan, like not necessarily a very good plan, but it has one, like an actual agenda, which is nice. Not as tough as it might look on paper, I discovered. Especially if you thought ahead to bring about a dozen other guys with you and lots of flasks of flaming oil. But that's the okay thing, because maybe the fight doesn't go on that long. But if you enjoyed the time that you spent recruiting a dozen people who are not in the cult and stocking up on flaming oil, then that's fine. That's time equally well spent. So it was a good resolution. Yeah.
I have one more thing to add for things that I liked, and that is, for these older modules, I like to add these little like historical artifact notes, right? These are things that I sometimes don't actually like, but I appreciate, I guess. And in this case, I actually do kind of like it. I'm coming around to the way these old modules do pre-gens. So in this one has the same situation where the pre-gens are basically just a few lines, like it's just stats and like and a loadout. You get like stats and like an equipment loadout, and it's in your character is essentially like 2 lines of information, right? On the face of it, it feels unsatisfying. Like, okay, that's not really a pre-gen. That's just someone rolled some dice for you and did a little equipment loadout, and that was it. But if you think about it again, going back to this module being released at a particular time in history, you have to again kind of realize or recognize that in 1982, a teenager especially would not have had the same kind of access to the types of technology and things that we do today, right? So it wouldn't have been as easy to make copies of different things. It wouldn't have been as easy to print things up. It wouldn't have been as easy to, to just kind of have like more detailed character things easy at hand, right? And what I love about this is you could take the module, and if you knew basically how D&D works, like you just understand the basic mechanics of D&D, you could take the module and just like, your friends could just like write down these couple of lines and you could start playing, right? Like you would not need to do the whole character creation process. You would not need to have extra rule books. You would need to have a bunch of papers. And I like that. I kind of appreciate that.
Yeah, it's fair. I mean, we're never going to use them ourselves, but it's nice that they were there in 1982.
It's fun to think about like, the time that this existed in, right? Let's go to questions we had about the module. I don't have any. It seems like you have a couple.
Yeah, I got a couple. There is a local helpful wizard. What do you think about that guy? Because to me, he seems like he's kind of there to save the players from themselves, possibly to the detriment of fun.
The only thing I can come up with is Romney does give the player characters like magic items and spells and stuff, and can even assist, like can come with the group. The only thing I can come up with is maybe Romney is there to help balance out the situation a little bit, because the dungeon is maybe a little tough for a first level.
Yeah, that is true, actually. Yeah.
That's the only thing I can think of.
I've been, I think pretty full of praise for this module so far, but I do have one slight issue, aesthetically speaking. So my question to you is this, Jason. If you were to read out a list of all the NPC names in this adventure, how many do you think you could get through without laughing?
Yeah, they're a bit silly, but I don't know. I don't think it's as bad as all that, but yeah.
I mean, we can run a test, actually.
You say them, I will try not to laugh.
Hewitt Twain, Grover Ruskadal, Donovan Allard, I'll allow you one snigger, Hubar Onfray.
Okay.
All
right. You're right, yeah. 3. All right. Chain lightning round. Go for it, Tom.
I like Vilma Meredy, the nosy, judgmental old lady who knows basically everything the PCs need to know if they think to ask.
Very fun to roleplay too, by the way. In the dungeon, on level 1, there is a door with a great big X on it that the cultists have charred onto the door. The door leads to a harpy den, and I think the reason why I like this is because it's pretty obvious that they built this lair around the harpy den. Like, the harpy was already there, and so they put a big door with an X so that the cultists wouldn't wander in on the harpy, right? But in play, it's actually really fun because you tell that to the player characters, and they, of course, want to go in, right?
After various scuffles with monsters in the filthy tunnels beneath the evil tavern, there is an exquisite statue of the Spirit Naga. And as foreshadowing goes, it's maybe a little bit on the nose, but it works really well. It's this mysterious but beautiful object. Our group was pretty fascinated by it.
And finally, there is a monster in the dungeon called the Bone Snapper. It's described as a T-Rex that's the size of a dog, and that just sounds really adorable to me. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. Tom, what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about a game concept that I am naming Water Margins and Dragons. So, yeah, this is going to be an exploration of why D&D is surprisingly good for playing games in the setting of classic Chinese adventure novel The Water Margin, and how you can alter some specific, fairly simple things to make that work. And I guess I should begin with explaining what the water margin is.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I am only familiar with it in a surface way.
The Water Margin, that's the Shui Hu Zhang in Mandarin, is a classic adventure novel, almost certainly mostly written by Shi Naian in the 14th century. It's in vernacular rather than classical Chinese, which is unusual for the time. And it tells the tales of 108 outlaws who get involved in various escapades, duels, jailbreaks, robberies, rebellions against the Song Dynasty Empire, although they get involved on both sides of those rebellions, and so on. And they sort of start all their various stories alone or in small groups, but they eventually congregate in a stronghold on Liangshan, a mountain that is surrounded by a large marsh that was kind of on the fringes of imperial control, and that is the water margin of the title. And it's kind of an ancestor of the wuxia genre. Now, wuxia kind of slightly existed before the 20th century, but it really became a thing, from after the 1900s. And the water margin is not the same. One way you can tell is because I like the water margin. To me, wuxia is kind of what happens when the water margin gets ruined by nerds. Like,
oh my god! So many people are so pissed right now listening to this. I'm publishing a game about wuxia. Right?
I know, and it does it really well, and that's one reason I liked playing it. But it's not a genre that calls to me. You know, I feel like it's the D&D 5th edition of Chinese adventure stories. There's this sort of the Jiang who becomes this very formalized network of sects rather than the sort of mishmash of counterculture that it originally represented. Things get categorized and everything seems to have a counterpart between each group in the setting. Now, obviously, categorizing things and making lists is a big part of Chinese culture traditionally. Wuxia sort of creates order where the water margin is a lot messier and about people causing disorder within a society that is supposed to be quite nailed down. How did this all begin? So I was playing Hearts of Wulin, as you mentioned, with my wife, and I needed a creepy village because that is a wuxia staple. And I thought, well, I've got Against the Cult of the Reptile God lying around. That's got a creepy village in it. Why don't I try it out? And as we were playing this, I discovered that a lot of the D&D material is not that useful for Hearts of Wulin, as you can imagine. I found myself reminded more of the water margin because there's a bit where two of the heroes, that's the heroes, mind you, are running a Sweeney Todd-style tavern where the guests sometimes end up in the dishes. Also looking at the temple that's been taken over by the cult in the adventure, I started daydreaming about that and thinking, oh, it's a bit like the temple in the opening chapter of The Water Margin where an idiotic official unleashes 108 demons. I started to think, yeah, I should run this in D&D, and here's why. Water Margin heroes are basically murder hobos. They're frequently accompanied by some of the heroes just despair of their idiotic, chaotic friends as they kind of forget to do the adventure. So basically, you've got these groups of D&D PCs walking around. The one who's sort of there thinking, no, we've got to go and do this thing. And then the one who's sort of pulling over the pillars in a Buddhist monastery or stealing a ghost-repelling pagoda and carrying it across the river to a nearby village. That was like a thing that made me think, yeah, this is good for D&D. They're also generally able to recognize other members of the Jianghu, often after a short brawl. So in other words, they know who the PCs are. And once I decided to run Reptile God in Song era China, things started to fall into place. Like, you start working on something and you realize, oh yeah, this is working quite well. So, for example, D&D clerics are not very much like anything in the Legends of King Arthur or Lord of the Rings, as many D&D nerds have complained about over the years.
Well, it's true. There's no easy analog to what a D&D cleric is, right?
That's right. But what do Taoist priests legendarily do with hopping vampires and the like?
I don't know. Tell me.
Okay. Well, they disable the undead by using magical talismans, and they banish demons with the peachwood swords that they carry around. So suddenly, this is working a lot better once you've renamed things. It's also abundantly clear that D&D spells just sound cooler when you frame them as if they're mystical martial arts things instead of,
Prismatic Sphere.
Well, Prismatic Sphere is pretty good, actually.
It's one of the better ones for sure. Magic Missile, maybe Fireball. I see what you're saying, though. Actually, side note, I have always believed, or at least not believed, but I've kind of suspected maybe that you were never, in the beginning of D&D, maybe you were never supposed to call the spells by their names in the fiction. Like, you weren't supposed to say Magic Missile, you weren't supposed to say Charm Person. You were supposed to, give it another cooler sounding name that's more appropriate for your setting. So I'm kind of with this in a way.
So yeah, that's one thing, just increasing the cool factor. And then as I started to roll up magic items for my pre-gen PCs, one of the things I got from the Blue Home book by Michael Thomas was a pair of boots that let the wearer travel 100 leagues in a day or something similarly magical, which is strikingly similar to an actual character in the water margin who has magic boots that let him travel and so on as well. So it maybe sounds like a trivial reskinning, but it actually seemed to me to fit the atmosphere of the book very well.
What do you want to talk about now? Where are we going with this?
Well, the next thing I kind of want to talk about is how you would achieve this. And if you're not that interested in running water margin games, maybe just use this as a parallel for thinking about what you would do. Fighters, thieves, and clerics, they just stay the same. You don't need to rename the cleric spells because they're just things like healing and purifying food. That's pretty much standard. Magic users, however, are not that great a match for the water margin. It does have magic in it, but it's mostly about controlling the weather or banishing demons and so on. I found that renaming them martial artists worked pretty well. So fighters are the big kind of soldier types who walk around in armor and get into tavern brawls, whereas the martial artists are not that physically tough, but they dedicate long practice sessions to esoteric techniques that no one really understands. And it also explains, if they're using D&D magic rules, why they only do their best moves more or less once per fight. So now I do concede that if you include all of the D&D spells and give them a light renaming, such as the Burning Palm technique, or the Tempest Pear Blossom Dance, which is Magic Missile, we kind of stray out of water margin territory. But you could choose just a slimmed down list so that things like Featherfall becomes Body Lightness, a kind of Qigong technique. Charm Person becomes a bewitching melody played on a flute. That works pretty well. When it came to making the pre-gens, I rolled up PCs for the players to choose from. And then, and this was my technique to start the atmosphere working as they were choosing who they'd play, I didn't give them names, but I did give them nicknames chosen from more obscure characters in the water margin itself. Because there's 108, nobody knows all of them. Did little cards with equipment packages for priests, fighters, scholars, bandits, thieves, merchants. I should give you some examples. So the priest gets a peachwood sword for driving away demons, an almanac, and an incense burner. The merchant gets a horse, a wine jug, and a sack of goods to trade. That kind of thing. Did little spell and technique cards for the priests and martial artists. And then finally, and this is maybe more useful to people who are running the Reptile God in just standard D&D, I came up with cards for why these various heroes were showing up in the village. Most of these I just took from the backstories of actual water margin characters. So, for example, one of them just says Imperial Envoy, sent to summon the temple's Grand Master to stop a plague in the city of Kaifeng. Another one is a bandit who's scouting the village to raid it for supplies and treasure later. Another one is an evil sect member bringing a message from their superior to the reptile cult master. Another one is a lawful sect member who doesn't know that the temple's been taken over and is bringing a message to the original abbot of the temple. The technique for this is you give all of the cards to the first player on your left, and they kind of look through them and take the one they want and pass the rest on. Everyone has an idea of what at least one person maybe is doing, because you have more cards than you have players. But those who have the fewest options to choose from, like the last couple of players, have the strongest idea of what the player to their left is doing. Yeah, and I found that was pretty good. So they were working at cross purposes, but they knew they were the PCs because, as previously mentioned, they all know heroes when they meet them. So eventually they teamed up to go and take on the Spirit Naga and defeat it.
Okay, I mean, so this is interesting. It was very interesting to see how your hacking or reskinning mind works. That's something we do a lot here at Fear of a Black Dragon. It's super interesting. Is there anything else you want to say about it?
Yeah, I guess there's one thing, which is that it's obviously it's technically a historical game, but I mean, if you think about the source novel, it wasn't that historical either. So it would refer to real people, but I mean, you need to know about as much about Song Dynasty China as you would glean from watching 2 kung fu movies and then sort of forgetting what year they were set in. I mean, if you're running a Robin Hood game, all you need to know is roughly what medieval peasants look like. And similarly, yeah, I would don't be afraid of that, because it's about as historical as the Forgotten Realms is. So
awesome. All right, thank you for that journey into your mind, Tom. Let's go to companion adventures. Hello, listeners. Jason here. We put a lot of care into the Gauntlet family of podcasts because we want you to be entertained and we want you to engage with these games that we love. And listening to us talk about role-playing games is great. Reading blog posts about role-playing games is great. Interacting on forums about role-playing games, such as the Gauntlet forums, that is also great. But in my opinion, nothing compares to actually playing tabletop role-playing games. And with that in mind, I want to invite you to check out our $8 Hangouts Friend Patreon tier. The Hangouts Friend tier gets you early RSVP access to new games posted on Gauntlet Hangouts, our amazing online gaming calendar, where we organize and run nearly 200 sessions per month. It is the absolute best way to get involved with the Gauntlet community, experience our awesome play culture, and importantly, play some role-playing games. We have done everything we can to make Gauntlet Hangouts as flexible and accessible as possible, and we have been successful. Over the last 2 years, we have organized 2,498 game sessions. The $8 tier also gets you access to new issues of our fantastic magazine Codex, where we publish all kinds of original games and supplements, as well as access to our Slack group, which is the heart of our community. It is a truly fantastic deal, and even if you only played in 1 or 2 games a month, it would be the best value in all of role-playing games. And not only do you get all the benefits I've mentioned here, but you also help support great podcasts like this one. So please head over to patreon.com/gauntlet and check it out. Thanks. It's the companion adventures. All of my companion adventures are just story game recommendations. So why don't you start?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll run through a quick few media recommendations. So first of all, the very excellent, although not that far into the story yet, Water Margin podcast, which is at outlawsofthemarsh.com. This is a kind of episodic, week-by-week retelling of the novel in English by, I think he's a Chinese guy that lives somewhere in America. And he also spent years doing the Romance of the Three Kingdoms podcast. And he's got a great kind of very approachable style. You can tell he knows his stuff about the novel, but he is also often, kind of very witty and engaging, and he kind of makes the characters come really alive. So highly recommended. And the website is full of all these kind of maps and reminding you who the characters are and telling you useful information of things that might not make sense when you listen to an episode. My second recommendation, my next 2 things are both to do with the boss monster. The fiction recommendation is The God in the Bowl by Robert E. Howard. This is a Conan the Barbarian short story that is relevant at a point that I won't specify, for spoiler reasons, but I will give you a bit of text. So I think it's sort of a good depiction of a certain monster. And it goes like this. Conan stared in wonder at the cold, classic beauty of that countenance, whose like he had never seen among the sons of men. Neither weakness, nor mercy, nor cruelty, nor kindness, nor any other human emotion was in those features. And then for film, I also think a good atmospheric look at how you might present that last approach into the dark cavern where the spirit Naga lies in wait is from the 1981 film Clash of the Titans, which was remade in 2000 or something, but this is the one with the Ray Harryhausen animations, and specifically the sequence where Perseus takes on the Medusa. So it's not like the best film ever made, but I think the air of menace in that particular scene is really good and very apt for the final confrontation in the adventure.
All of my recommendations this week are different story games. One of the things that we try to accomplish on Fear of a Black Dragon is to share different parts of the hobby with people who maybe are not familiar with them. You know, a lot of our listeners who are mostly keyed into classic fantasy gaming or OSR design and OSR play may not be aware of some of these quite good story games that explore some of the themes of Against the Cult of the Reptile God in a really cool way and might be worth checking out. I'm going to recommend Soth by Steve Hickey, which I'm actually currently running right now, as it turns out. Soth is a game where you play in a small town in America, one of 3 different time periods, the 20s, the 50s, or the 80s, and your characters are cultists who are trying to complete 4 rituals to bring forth the dark god Soth into the world. And I kind of like the idea here of cultists in a regular town, which is kind of what's going on in Orlane, right? And this is a really, really great game because it has really nice elements of like a Coen Brothers film mixed with sort of Lovecraftian horror. Like it's kind of smashes those two things up in a really cool way. And so very, 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 very fond of that game. I'm going to suggest Monster Hearts 2 by Avery Alder. That is a game about young people in a small town who are secretly monsters, or not secretly necessarily, but they are monsters. They do all the sorts of normal, messy teenage things that teenagers do, but then they also occasionally monster out, right, and do monstrous things as well. It's a really, really great game, probably in my top 3 favorite games of all time. And in particular, there is a skin, which is what we call a playbook or a character class in Monster Hearts. There's a skin called the Serpentine, so you can play a literal snake person in that. Going with this sort of idea that you kind of alluded to a little bit, Tom, which is certain parts of Against the Cult of the Reptile God have sword and sorcery feels, right? Very Conan, very sword and sorcery, particularly as we kind of push towards the end of it. And I'm going to recommend a couple of my very favorite sword and sorcery story games. The first is In a Wicked Age by Vincent Baker. Probably another one of my very, very favorite games of all time, not just sword and sorcery, but it does this really great thing where you get to kind of experience different eras. Like, so you play for a session and that's a certain group of characters in one particular era. And then you play in the next session and we kind of get to see how the actions of the characters in the first session influence these new characters. And maybe it's like 100 years or 200 years in the future, or maybe it's in the past, who knows? But we get to kind of see how these different things kind of connect up. And it has just lots of great sort of swords and sorcery Conan-esque flavor to it. I also like Swords Without Master by Epidiah Ravachol, which is very, very classically kind of a Robert E. Howard sort of story that it tells, that revolves around all the mechanics revolve around these 2 emotional states, and that's kind of what you're rolling. Like you roll every scene, you roll a die to see which emotional state is going to be flavoring the scene. And the 2 states are jovial and glum. And so you kind of bounce between those 2 things. It also does some really, really cool things with narrative structure and reincorporating like thematic elements, which of course is something listeners know that I love. And finally, A Cozy Den by Kira McGran. I have not played A Cozy Den yet. I've only read it, but it is a game about lesbian snake women who are supporting each other and living their lives. And and it's great. They're lesbosnakes is the actual name of the species according to the text, and it's a great read. It's a very cute, cozy game about lesbian snake women, and I don't know. I like that there's space to have games about all kinds of stuff. So, and with that, listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find us on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We have a forums. It's forums.gauntlet-rpg.com. You can come join the conversation over there. We are also on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks to Luke Wade, our indefatigable editor, and thanks to you, listeners.
Take care.